The first blow came with the sound of shattering glass, cash flow gone, dreams crumbling, legacy undone. Silence followed, heavy and suffocating, as the once untouchable millionaire stood amidst the wreckage of everything he'd built. I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're sitting in a quiet room after a long day, or maybe you're cooking a simple meal for someone who never notices the effort. It doesn't matter what time it is, but I promise you, today's story will move you. This is about Gregory Finch, who once commanded a fortune worth hundreds of millions in San Francisco's financial district. His penthouse kitchen gleamed with $10,000 appliances that had never felt the warmth of a loving hand. Across town, in a cramped apartment above a corner laundromat, lived Carmen Valdez, a woman whose weathered hands held more wisdom than all of Gregory's stock certificates combined. She had been rising at 4 a.m. for 15 years, preparing meals for families who barely knew her name. Carmen's story began not in culinary school, but in her mother's tiny kitchen in East San Jose, where she learned that love could be measured in pinches of salt and patient stirring. When her mother grew sick, 12-year-old Carmen stood on wooden crates to reach the stove, cooking beans and rice for her 3 younger siblings while her father worked double shifts at the cannery. Food was survival then, but somewhere between those desperate meals and endless days, it became her language of care. By 35, Carmen was working as a private cook for the Wellington family in Pacific Heights, old money San Francisco, where her presence was expected but never acknowledged. She arrived each morning before sunrise, her worn sneakers silent on marble floors, preparing elaborate breakfasts that the family consumed while discussing stock portfolios and real estate investments. They spoke around her as if she were invisible, debating whether to liquidate assets or invest in cryptocurrency while she refilled their organic fair trade coffee. Meanwhile, Gregory Finch's empire stretched across venture capital, tech investments, and a restaurant chain that bore his name. His net worth fluctuated by millions daily, but he measured success only in numbers that climbed higher and higher. His own kitchen, designed by European architects, remained pristine and untouched. He dined exclusively at high-end establishments where celebrity chefs charged $300 for molecular gastronomy that looked like art but tasted like ambition. Carmen's daily humiliations were subtle but constant. Mrs. Wellington would critique the temperature of her poached eggs, never meeting Carmen's eyes. The teenage daughter complained that Carmen's homemade tortillas were too ethnic for her friends. During dinner parties, Carmen served course after course to guests who discussed their children's private school tuitions and summer homes in Napa, while she calculated whether her own paycheck would cover her son's textbooks. The cruelest moments came during family gatherings. Carmen would spend days preparing elaborate holiday feasts, golden turkeys, perfectly seasoned stuffing, desserts that took hours to craft. She'd watch through the kitchen doorway as the family shared laughter and stories around the table she had set, while she ate her own simple meal standing by the sink. When guests complimented the food, Mrs. Wellington accepted praise as if she had cooked it herself. Yet Carmen found solace in unexpected places. The Wellingtons' youngest son, 8-year-old Michael, would sneak into the kitchen after school. He'd perch on a stool, mesmerized as Carmen chopped vegetables or kneaded dough. She taught him Spanish words for ingredients, ajo for garlic, canela for cinnamon. He was the only family member who said thank you for his meals, the only one who asked about her own children. One afternoon, while Carmen prepared lunch, Michael asked why her hands always smelled like comfort. She paused, holding an onion that had made her eyes water, or perhaps the tears came from somewhere deeper. "Mijo," she whispered, "cooking is not about the ingredients. It's about putting your heart on the plate, even when nobody notices." The Wellington family's fortune was built on pharmaceutical investments and inherited wealth, passed down through generations who had never known hunger. But Gregory's empire was different. New money earned through aggressive investments in biotech startups and cryptocurrency ventures. He owned 3 homes worth $15 million combined, held stocks in companies whose names appeared in Forbes, and had enough money in offshore accounts to buy a small country. Then came the autumn when everything changed. Gregory's investment firm faced federal investigation for securities fraud. His partners had been skimming funds using client money for unauthorized cryptocurrency trades. Within weeks, his assets were frozen, his reputation destroyed. The man who once controlled hundreds of millions in revenue watched his net worth plummet to negative territory as lawsuits multiplied like California wildfire. Meanwhile, Carmen received news that broke her heart in a different way. Mrs. Wellington, citing budget constraints from a recent market downturn, was letting her go. After 15 years of loyal service, Carmen was dismissed with 2 weeks severance and a letter of recommendation that praised her reliability, but mentioned nothing about her devotion, her skill, or the countless hours she'd worked without complaint. Carmen's last day in the Wellington kitchen was a Friday in November. She cleaned every surface until it gleamed, left detailed notes about the family's preferences, and packed her few personal items into a cardboard box. Nobody was home to say goodbye. She left her keys on the marble counter and walked out of the house where she'd spent a third of her life, tears mixing with the San Francisco fog. Gregory's fall was more public, but equally devastating. The penthouse was auctioned to pay creditors. His luxury cars were repossessed. The restaurant chain that bore his name was sold to competitors. He moved into a studio apartment in the Tenderloin, subsisting on unemployment benefits and the generosity of his few remaining friends. The man who once decided the fate of millions of dollars now counted pennies to buy ramen noodles. Pride prevented Gregory from asking for help. Even as hunger became his constant companion. He'd walk past restaurants where he once dined, now unable to afford a cup of coffee. His expensive suits hung loose on his shrinking frame, and his manicured hands grew calloused from odd jobs that barely paid minimum wage. It was during one of these desperate wanderings that Gregory discovered a narrow alley in the Mission District, where Carmen had opened a tiny food stand with her severance pay and life savings. She served simple meals, tamales made from her grandmother's recipe, pozole that simmered for hours, fresh tortillas pressed by hand. The stand had no name, just a hand-painted sign that read, "Comida Casera," in fading blue letters. Gregory stood at the edge of the alley for 20 minutes before approaching, his former arrogance wrestling with genuine hunger. Carmen looked up from her steaming pots and saw something in his hollow eyes that reminded her of her father during the worst times, pride mixed with desperation, dignity barely holding against necessity. Without judgment or recognition, she ladled a bowl of pozole and set it before him. The broth was rich with hominy and tender pork, seasoned with chilies and garlic and something indefinable, the taste of hands that had stirred with purpose for decades. Gregory's first spoonful transported him beyond his current misery to his childhood kitchen, where his abuela had cooked similar meals before success and ambition had erased those simpler memories. Tears fell into Gregory's soup as he realized what he'd lost, not just money or status, but the ability to recognize love when it was served on a chipped bowl. Carmen watched this broken man weep over her grandmother's recipe and understood that sometimes healing required nothing more than being witnessed in your moment of deepest need. Carmen began to notice Gregory returning each day, always ordering the same pozole, always leaving exact change with shaking hands. She observed how he savored each spoonful as if it contained salvation, how he studied her movements as she cooked with the intensity of someone trying to solve life's greatest mystery. Gradually, she began adding extra meat to his portion, claiming it was leftover that would spoil otherwise. Their conversation started with polite exchanges about the weather, then deepened as Gregory's defenses cracked like old paint in San Francisco's relentless fog. He confessed his fall from grace, his shame at losing everything, his discovery that wealth had been both his achievement and his prison. Carmen listened without judgment, sharing stories of her own struggles, raising 3 children on a cook's wages, caring for her diabetic mother, sending money to relatives in Mexico even when her own cupboards were bare. Gregory learned that Carmen's seemingly simple life contained depths his privileged existence had never fathomed. Her knowledge of healing through food rivaled any nutritionist's education. She knew which herbs soothed heartbreak, how long to simmer bones to extract maximum comfort, why certain combinations of spices could restore faith in tomorrow. Her hands, scarred from years of burns and cuts, created magic from the humblest ingredients. The revelation came slowly, like dawn breaking over the Mission Hills. This woman, who had been invisible in Pacific Heights, serving meals to people who treated her like furniture, possessed wisdom that no business school had taught Gregory. She understood that true wealth lay not in offshore accounts or real estate portfolios, but in the ability to nourish souls through simple acts of care. But their fragile peace was shattered when health inspectors, likely prompted by complaints from established restaurants jealous of Carmen's growing reputation, arrived at her stand. They found minor violations: a permit that had expired by 3 days, a sink that was 2 inches too small according to regulations, storage containers that didn't meet newest standards. The fines totaled more than Carmen's monthly income, threatening to close the stand that had become her lifeline and Gregory's salvation. Gregory watched Carmen's dream crumble with the same helpless fury he'd felt during his own downfall. But this time, something different stirred within him, not the desperate self-preservation that had driven his business dealings, but genuine desire to protect someone who had shown him kindness without expecting anything in return. Using his few remaining connections and knowledge of regulatory systems, he helped Carmen navigate the bureaucracy, filling out forms and making phone calls that would have overwhelmed her. Their partnership deepened as they fought together against a system designed to favor established businesses over struggling entrepreneurs. Gregory discovered that his years of managing million-dollar deals had prepared him for this smaller but more meaningful battle. He negotiated payment plans for Carmen's fines, found second-hand equipment that met health codes, and even convinced a sympathetic inspector to provide warnings rather than citations for future violations. In return, Carmen taught Gregory lessons no MBA program could provide. She showed him how to taste food with his heart rather than his palate, how to read customers' moods and their choice of spice level, how to find joy in the simple act of feeding someone who was hungry. His hands, once soft from privilege, grew strong from chopping vegetables and lifting heavy pots. His soul, once hollow from chasing empty victories, began filling with the satisfaction of meaningful work. The transformation wasn't instant or easy. Gregory struggled with his new reality, living paycheck to paycheck, finding purpose in work that society dismissed as menial. Former colleagues who hadn't lost everything in the crash would sometimes pass Carmen's stand, their eyes sliding over Gregory as if he'd become as invisible as Carmen once was. Some whispered cruel jokes about how far the mighty had fallen, never imagining that his fall had actually been a rise toward something more valuable than money. Carmen faced her own challenges as their unlikely partnership attracted attention. Some customers questioned why she'd hired a former millionaire, suspicious that he might be exploiting her kindness or planning to steal her recipes. Others worried that his presence would bring unwanted scrutiny to their neighborhood sanctuary. She endured gossip and criticism with the same patience she'd shown during years of mistreatment in Pacific Heights, understanding that people's judgment often reflected their own fears rather than truth. But slowly, transformation emerged from their shared labor. Gregory's business acumen, tempered by Carmen's wisdom about human nature, helped expand their operation thoughtfully. They added a few tables to the alley, painted a mural that celebrated the neighborhood's Mexican heritage, and created a menu that honored Carmen's family recipes while accommodating their customers' dietary needs and budgets. The stand became more than a place to buy food. It evolved into a community gathering spot where construction workers shared tables with office clerks, where elderly residents found affordable meals prepared with care, where children could always count on a free piece of bread when their families struggled. Carmen's invisible years in Pacific Heights had prepared her for this moment, when her visibility would matter not for serving others, but for leading a small corner of her community toward nourishment and connection. Gregory learned to find richness in experiences that his former wealth had obscured. The satisfaction of seeing Carmen smile when a customer praised her mole. The pride in knowing that his vegetable prep contributed to someone's comfort. The peace that came from falling asleep exhausted by honest labor rather than stressed by market fluctuations. He discovered that his previous life, despite all its luxuries, had been poorer than his current existence. Their success attracted notice from local food bloggers and eventually a newspaper reporter who wanted to write about the unlikely partnership between a disgraced millionaire and an immigrant cook. The article was meant to be uplifting, but it brought unwanted attention that threatened their carefully built peace. Health inspectors returned, this time with microscopic scrutiny that seemed designed to find fault. Competitors complained about their growing customer base, claiming unfair advantages. Immigration officials began asking questions about Carmen's documented status and that of her family members who sometimes helped during busy periods. The weight of bureaucracy and jealousy pressed down on their small operation like fog rolling in from the Pacific. The crisis peaked on a rainy Tuesday morning when Carmen arrived to find official notices posted on her stand. Multiple violations, immediate closure ordered, thousands of dollars in fines that would bankrupt her modest savings. Gregory found her sitting on a milk crate in the alley, rain streaming down her face, hands holding the crumpled papers that represented the destruction of everything they'd built together. For a moment, Gregory felt the familiar urge to flee, to protect himself from association with someone else's failing venture. But looking at Carmen's defeated posture, he remembered how she had never turned away from his brokenness, never weaponized his vulnerability against him. Her generosity had sustained him through his darkest months. Now it was his turn to stand steady while storms threatened her dreams. Using skills learned during his corporate years but applying them with a moral compass Carmen had helped him discover, Gregory fought back against the bureaucratic assault. He researched the backgrounds of competing restaurants that had filed complaints, uncovering their own code violations and health department citations. He documented inconsistencies in how regulations were enforced, building a case for discriminatory treatment based on Carmen's ethnicity and their operations' success among working-class customers. More importantly, he organized their community's support. Construction workers testified about how Carmen's meals gave them strength for dangerous labor. Elderly residents wrote letters about how her affordable food and gentle conversation had sustained them through lonely weeks. Parents explained how Carmen always found ways to feed their children during month-end budget crunches, never accepting payment from families who truly couldn't afford it. The hearing took place in a sterile government building that smelled of disappointment and bureaucratic indifference. Carmen sat beside Gregory, her hands folded in her lap, wearing her best dress and the dignity she'd maintained through decades of being overlooked. Gregory presented their case with the same intensity he'd once brought to million-dollar negotiations, but this time fighting for something infinitely more valuable than profit margins. When the hearing officer announced that Carmen could reopen with a reduced fine and a probationary period, the small crowd of supporters erupted in quiet celebration. But Carmen's victory felt different from Gregory's past business triumphs. It was sweeter because it was shared, more meaningful because it served others rather than feeding ego. The stand reopened on a sunny morning in spring, with a line of customers stretching around the block. Carmen's hands moved with practiced grace, ladling soup and pressing tortillas, while Gregory managed orders and cleaned tables. They had found their rhythm as partners, each contributing unique skills toward a common purpose that felt larger than themselves. Months passed in this peaceful productivity. Gregory learned Spanish from Carmen and her customers, his vocabulary expanding beyond business terms to include words for comfort, community, and home. Carmen practiced her English with Gregory, gaining confidence in speaking up for herself and her needs. Together, they navigated the challenges of small business ownership, managing inventory, handling difficult customers, planning for seasonal changes in their neighborhood's rhythms. The letter arrived on a Thursday afternoon, formal and intimidating in its official envelope. The Wellington family was hosting a charity fundraiser and wanted to hire Carmen to cater the event. The irony was profound. The woman they had dismissed without ceremony was now being invited back as a successful entrepreneur, her skills suddenly valuable because they came with media attention and community recognition. Carmen's first instinct was to decline, to protect herself from returning to a place where she had endured years of casual humiliation. But Gregory, understanding her hesitation, suggested a different approach. What if they used this opportunity to showcase not just Carmen's talent, but the dignity she had maintained despite her former employer's blindness? They accepted the catering job with conditions. Carmen would work as an equal partner, not a servant. She would prepare her own recipes, not attempt to recreate the molecular gastronomy the Wellingtons typically preferred. Most importantly, she would be introduced to guests as the owner of a successful neighborhood business, not simply as hired help. The night of the fundraiser, Carmen entered the Pacific Heights mansion through the front door for the first time in 15 years. The kitchen where she had spent countless invisible hours looked smaller than she remembered, its marble surfaces gleaming but somehow cold compared to her alley stand's warm chaos. Gregory helped her set up serving stations, his presence providing stability as memories threatened to overwhelm her composure. The guests were San Francisco's elite, tech executives, real estate investors, society matrons whose charity work often consisted of writing checks rather than understanding need. They commented politely on the authentic Mexican food, praising its rustic charm, as if Carmen's grandmother's recipes were curiosities rather than sophisticated culinary traditions passed down through generations of knowledge. But something remarkable happened as the evening progressed. The food's genuine warmth began affecting people who had forgotten what hunger felt like, whose palates had been dulled by decades of eating for status rather than nourishment. Conversations grew more animated around plates of Carmen's mole. Laughter became more genuine over her perfectly seasoned pozole. Mrs. Wellington, now grayer and more fragile than Carmen remembered, approached hesitantly as the evening wound down. Her eyes held recognition, mixed with something that might have been shame. She started to speak, perhaps to offer the apology that had been 15 years overdue, but Carmen's gentle smile stopped her. "The food was beautiful tonight," Mrs. Wellington whispered. "Thank you," Carmen replied, her voice steady and kind. "It always was." The moment passed without drama or confrontation, but it carried profound weight. Carmen had not come seeking vengeance or even acknowledgement of past wrongs. She had simply returned as her full self, accomplished, respected, no longer invisible, and that transformation was more powerful than any angry confrontation could have been. Gregory watched this exchange from across the room, understanding that he was witnessing something sacred. Carmen's grace in the face of her former employer's awkwardness showed him how healing could occur without forcing others to pay for past blindness. Her success was not diminished by forgiveness. Rather, it was enhanced by her refusal to let old wounds poison present joy. The catering job led to others, but Carmen was careful to accept only events that honored her work rather than exploiting it. Her reputation grew through word-of-mouth recommendations from satisfied customers, each meal serving as testimony to the power of cooking with genuine care. Food critics began discovering their stand, writing reviews that praised not just Carmen's technique, but the atmosphere of community warmth she had created. Gregory's role evolved as their business expanded. He managed the financial aspects that had once overwhelmed Carmen, negotiating contracts and handling bookkeeping with skills refined through previous success and failure. But more importantly, he served as bridge between Carmen's culinary vision and customers who might otherwise dismiss her because of assumptions about class or education. Their partnership challenged both of them in ways that resulted in growth. Gregory learned to find satisfaction in work that served others rather than feeding his own ambition. Carmen discovered that her voice, once silenced by economic necessity, carried wisdom that deserved to be heard and respected. 1 year after Carmen had been dismissed from the Wellington mansion, she and Gregory opened a small restaurant near their original alley stand. The space was modest but warm, decorated with photographs showing the Mission District's history and Carmen's family recipes handwritten on chalkboards. They hired local residents, many of whom had been customers at the stand, creating employment opportunities in a neighborhood that had struggled with gentrification and displacement. The restaurant's success was measured not just in profit margins, though it became financially stable, but in its impact on the surrounding community. Carmen's hiring practices prioritized single mothers and workers returning from incarceration, people who faced barriers similar to those she had encountered. Gregory used his knowledge of business regulations to help other immigrant entrepreneurs navigate the complex process of establishing legal operations. Their story attracted attention from national media outlets interested in the narrative of redemption and unlikely partnership. But Carmen and Gregory remained focused on daily work rather than publicity, understanding that their real achievement lay in creating sustainable employment and nourishing their neighbors rather than building personal celebrity. The phone call came on a quiet afternoon while Carmen was preparing that day's special, her mother's recipe for chicken and mole poblano, a dish that required 3 hours of careful attention and 17 different ingredients blended with perfect timing. Michael Wellington, now 16 years old, had tracked down her number through social media and wanted to visit the restaurant. He arrived nervous and tall, no longer the small boy who had perched on kitchen stools asking about spice names. Carmen recognized him immediately, though 8 years had transformed him from child to young adult. He had driven himself to the Mission District against his mother's wishes, seeking something he couldn't quite articulate but desperately needed. Over a bowl of pozole that tasted exactly like his childhood memories, Michael confessed that he had spent years feeling guilty about Carmen's dismissal. He had wanted to speak up, but hadn't known how to challenge adult decisions that seemed unfair. Now, preparing for college and thinking about his future, he needed to understand whether forgiveness was possible for bystanders who had failed to act when they witnessed injustice. Carmen listened to his confession with the same patience she had shown when he was 8 years old and struggling to pronounce Spanish words. Her response came not through lecturing, but through action. She invited him into the kitchen, teaching him to press masa for tortillas while they talked about accountability, growth, and the difference between guilt and responsibility. Gregory, observing from the dining room, recognized in Michael's visit an echo of his own journey toward understanding. The young man was grappling with questions that Gregory had avoided for decades. What obligations do privileged people have toward those who serve them? How can individuals challenge systems that benefit them at others' expense? What does genuine allyship look like in daily practice? Michael began visiting regularly, learning cooking techniques while processing his complicated feelings about his family's wealth and the workers who had made their comfort possible. Carmen found in him the son she had always hoped her own boys might become: thoughtful about power, curious about justice, willing to examine uncomfortable truths about class and privilege. Through Michael's eyes, Carmen revisited her years in his family's kitchen with less pain and more clarity. She recognized that her invisibility then had been their loss as much as her suffering. They had missed opportunities to learn from her knowledge, to be enriched by her perspective, to expand their understanding of what constituted valuable contribution to the world. The restaurant's second anniversary celebration filled their dining room with customers who had become like extended family. Construction workers who had eaten lunch at the original alley stand shared tables with food bloggers who had discovered Carmen's genius. Elderly neighbors chatted with young families from other parts of the city who made weekly pilgrimages for authentic cuisine prepared with generational wisdom. Gregory stood behind the bar that evening, polishing glasses and observing the scene with quiet satisfaction. His reflection in the window showed a man transformed by purpose. his face lined with honest work rather than stress, his hands strong from labor, his eyes clear with contentment that no stock portfolio had ever provided. He had learned to measure wealth in customers' smiles, community connections, and the dignified work of serving others. Carmen moved through the dining room that night like the queen she had always been, finally crowned with the recognition she had never sought but richly deserved. Her customers didn't just order meals from her, they trusted her to nourish their bodies and souls. Children asked for extra tortillas, knowing she would never refuse them. Adults sought her advice on everything from cooking techniques to life decisions, understanding that her wisdom extended far beyond the kitchen. The evening's high point came when Carmen's 3 children, now adults with families of their own, surprised her by arriving together for the celebration. They had seen their mother struggle through years when her talents were unrecognized, watched her maintain dignity while being treated as invisible. Now they witnessed her triumph, not just business success, but the deeper victory of being valued for her full self. As closing time approached, Gregory and Carmen worked together cleaning up after the celebration. Their movements had the synchronicity of long partnership, each anticipating the other's needs with outspoken communication. The kitchen, still warm from the evening's cooking, felt like the heart of something larger than a restaurant. It had become a symbol of what was possible when people's true gifts were recognized and honored. Carmen paused in her cleaning, looking around the space that had become her domain, not through inheritance or privilege, but through skill, perseverance, and the courage to begin again after everything had seemed lost. The walls held photographs of customers who had become friends, reviews from critics who had discovered genius in her grandmother's recipes, certificates recognizing her contributions to the community. But more than external validation, Carmen felt the internal satisfaction of work aligned with purpose. Every meal she prepared carried forward traditions that might otherwise have been forgotten, nourished people who trusted her care, created gathering spaces where community could flourish. She had transformed from invisible servant to visible leader, from dismissed employee to respected entrepreneur. Gregory finished the last of the dishes and joined Carmen in surveying their domain. His journey had taken him from penthouse to poverty to this middle ground where wealth was measured not in dollars, but in impact, where success meant serving others rather than accumulating for himself. He had lost everything the world said mattered and found everything that actually did. Looking toward the future, Carmen and Gregory planned to open a culinary training program for other immigrants and returning citizens, teaching not just cooking techniques but business skills that could lead to economic independence. They envisioned expanding their model, restaurants that prioritized community service over maximum profit, that created employment opportunities for people facing systemic barriers, that celebrated cultural traditions while building bridges across differences. Their story had become larger than personal redemption. It offered a template for how individuals could challenge systems that rendered hard-working people invisible. By succeeding on their own terms rather than conforming to others' expectations, they had proven that alternative definitions of success were not just possible, but more sustainable and satisfying than traditional measures of achievement. The night air was cool as they locked up the restaurant and walked toward their respective homes. Carmen's was a small apartment she now owned rather than rented, decorated with her grandmother's photographs and filled with the comfort of security earned through her own labor. Gregory's was a modest cottage that he had purchased with savings accumulated through honest work, furnished simply but comfortable in its lack of pretension. Their daily partnership had evolved into something deeper than business collaboration, a friendship based on mutual respect, shared values, and the understanding that their individual transformations had been possible because they had witnessed and supported each other through difficult changes. Carmen's grace had taught Gregory about dignity. His business skills had helped Carmen build the platform her talents deserved. As they reached the corner where their paths diverged, Carmen turned to Gregory with the smile that had first offered him salvation in a bowl of soup. Mañana, she said simply, the Spanish word that meant both tomorrow and morning. A promise that their work would continue, that their community would be fed, that their partnership would persist in serving something larger than themselves. Gregory nodded, understanding that mañana contained multitudes, the promise of another day's meaningful work, the hope for continued growth and service, the faith that their unlikely partnership would continue creating ripples of positive change in an often harsh world. He had learned enough Spanish to know that mañana also suggested patience, the understanding that worthwhile things develop slowly rather than appearing overnight. Walking home through the Mission District's quiet streets, Gregory reflected on the profound irony of his journey. He had achieved everything American culture promised would bring satisfaction: wealth, status, recognition, power, only to discover emptiness at the summit. His true education had begun when he lost everything external and found himself dependent on the kindness of someone he had been trained by society's hierarchies to overlook. Carmen's path home took her past the original alley where their partnership had begun. The narrow space was quiet now, but she could still smell the ghosts of countless meals prepared there during the hardest months of rebuilding her life. That difficult period had been necessary preparation for current success, teaching her to trust her own judgment rather than seeking validation from people whose approval would always be contingent on their convenience. Both understood that their story was not unique. Across America, talented people labored in invisibility, while others claimed credit for achievements they had not earned. Their small success would not solve systemic problems of inequality and exploitation, but it offered proof that individual transformation was possible, that partnership across class lines could benefit everyone involved, that recognizing hidden talent could unleash tremendous creative and economic potential. The restaurant would reopen tomorrow and the day after, and hopefully for many years to come. Carmen would rise before dawn to begin preparing foods that connected her customers to traditions of nourishment stretching back generations. Gregory would arrive an hour later, grateful for work that served others rather than feeding his own ambitions. Together, they would continue the daily practice of transforming humble ingredients into something approaching magic, meals that sustained not just bodies, but souls. Their success story was not the rags to riches narrative that American mythology typically celebrated. Instead, it was something rarer and more valuable: the recognition that true wealth lay in meaningful work, authentic relationships, and the capacity to serve others while maintaining personal dignity. They had discovered that poverty came not from lack of money, but from lack of purpose, and that abundance could be measured in community connection rather than individual accumulation. Carmen's culinary training program began 6 months after their second anniversary celebration, housed in the basement of a community center that had offered them space at reduced rent. The first class included 12 students, 3 recent immigrants from Guatemala and El Salvador, 2 formerly incarcerated men seeking skills for re-entry into society, 4 single mothers hoping to start catering businesses, 2 teenagers who had aged out of foster care, and 1 elderly woman whose husband's death had left her needing to support herself for the first time in 50 years. Carmen's teaching style reflected the patience she had learned from her own mother's kitchen. She didn't just demonstrate knife skills and cooking techniques, she shared the stories behind each recipe, the cultural significance of ingredients, the ways that food could carry memory and hope across oceans and generations. Her students learned that masa for tamales required not just corn flour and lard, but understanding of how weather affected dough consistency, how to read the mesa's texture through their fingers, how to fold the corn husks so the filling stayed secure during steaming. Gregory managed the business aspects of the program, helping students develop plans for their own food ventures. He taught them about permits and licenses, food safety regulations, basic accounting, and marketing strategies that honored their cultural backgrounds rather than hiding them. His own experiences with business failure made him uniquely qualified to prepare them for challenges they would face: discrimination from customers who questioned their competence, officials who might enforce regulations more strictly against immigrant entrepreneurs, the psychological difficulty of persisting when early attempts at success met with indifference or hostility. The program's first graduate was Maria Gonzalez, a single mother from Guatemala who had been working nights cleaning office buildings while raising 3 young children. Carmen's classes gave her skills to start a weekend catering business specializing in traditional Guatemalan dishes that reminded her immigrant community of home. Within a year, Maria had saved enough money to quit her cleaning job and focus full-time on her growing catering enterprise, hiring 2 other women from the neighborhood to help with large events. Success stories multiplied slowly but steadily. Carlos, who had spent 15 years in prison for drug-related offenses, used skills learned in Carmen's program to get hired as prep cook at a downtown restaurant, then worked his way up to sous chef within 2 years. The elderly woman, Dorothy, began baking her famous apple pies for local coffee shops, earning enough supplemental income to remain in the apartment she had shared with her late husband, rather than moving to subsidized senior housing. But perhaps the most profound transformation occurred in the students themselves. People who had internalized messages about their own limitations discovered pride in mastering complex techniques. Immigrants who had been told their food was too foreign for American palates learned to present their cuisine with confidence rather than apology. Formerly incarcerated individuals found ways to rebuild their identities around their skills rather than their mistakes. Carmen's program attracted attention from culinary institutes and social service organizations interested in replicating her model. She began receiving invitations to speak at conferences about using food education to address poverty, immigration integration, and criminal justice reform. But she remained focused on the daily work of teaching, understanding that her real impact lay in individual relationships with students rather than in broad policy discussions. Gregory's role in the program expanded as his Spanish improved and his understanding of systemic barriers deepened. He began volunteering with immigration advocacy organizations, using his business knowledge to help undocumented entrepreneurs navigate the complex process of establishing legitimate operations under names of documented family members. His privileged background, which had once isolated him from people's struggles, now provided access to professional networks that could benefit Carmen's students. The partnership between privilege and wisdom, between Carmen's cultural knowledge and Gregory's institutional access, created opportunities that neither could have achieved alone. When one of their students faced deportation proceedings, Gregory's connections to immigration attorneys and Carmen's community relationships combined to generate enough support, legal representation, character witnesses, media attention, to secure a stay of removal that allowed the student to remain with his American-born children. 3 years after the first class graduated, Carmen and Gregory opened a second restaurant location on the other side of the city, in a predominantly African-American neighborhood that had been underserved by quality, affordable dining options. This expansion required them to learn about different cultural traditions and culinary preferences, to build relationships with community leaders who had reasons to be skeptical of outsiders claiming to serve their needs. The process was humbling for both of them. Carmen, despite her own experiences with marginalization, had to confront her own assumptions about African American food culture and recognize that her expertise with Mexican cuisine didn't automatically translate to understanding soul food traditions or Caribbean flavors preferred by many of their new neighbors. Gregory faced the challenge of building trust in a community that had historical reasons to be suspicious of business ventures initiated by people who could afford to leave if the investment proved unsuccessful. They spent months attending community meetings, volunteering at local events, and hiring neighborhood residents not just as employees, but as consultants who could guide their menu development and service approach. The second restaurant's success depended not on transplanting their Mission District model, but on adapting their core principles, dignified employment, affordable prices, community connection to fit a different neighborhood's specific needs and preferences. Carmen's influence in San Francisco's food scene grew as restaurant critics and food writers began recognizing her contributions to the city's culinary landscape. She received awards from immigrant advocacy organizations, was featured in magazine articles about successful entrepreneurs, and even appeared as guest chef at high-end restaurants that wanted to showcase authentic Mexican cuisine prepared by someone who understood its cultural significance rather than treating it as trendy fusion. But fame sat uneasily on Carmen's shoulders. She remained most comfortable in her kitchen, hands deep in masa, answering students' questions about technique, listening to customers' stories over lunch. The attention was gratifying after decades of invisibility, but she worried that celebrity might distance her from the community work that gave her life meaning. Gregory helped her navigate these opportunities while staying true to their shared values. When television producers approached about a cooking show, they structured the proposal around featuring Carmen's students and their own food businesses, rather than focusing solely on her personal story. When cookbook publishers expressed interest, Carmen insisted on including her graduates' recipes alongside her own, sharing credit and potential profits with the women whose knowledge had enriched her own understanding. The cookbook project became a community effort that took 2 years to complete. Carmen worked with her students to document not just ingredient lists and cooking instructions, but the stories behind each recipe, how they had traveled across borders, how they had sustained families through difficult times, how they connected immigrant communities to ancestral knowledge while adapting to new environments and available ingredients. Gregory managed the business aspects of the cookbook publication while learning about the food traditions being documented. His own transformation continued as he absorbed stories about resilience, creativity, and the ways that cooking could preserve identity while enabling adaptation. The foreword he wrote for the book reflected his journey from ignorance to appreciation, from consumer to collaborator in the ongoing work of building community through food. The book's publication brought national attention to their restaurants and training programs. Carmen received invitations to appear on morning television shows and speak at food festivals across the country. But she accepted only opportunities that allowed her to highlight systemic issues affecting immigrant entrepreneurs, to advocate for policy changes that would make it easier for people like her students to start legal businesses, to challenge stereotypes about the skill and knowledge required to prepare authentic ethnic cuisine. Meanwhile, the daily work continued. Carmen still arrived at her restaurants before dawn, prepping vegetables and starting broths that would simmer throughout the day. Gregory still managed schedules and inventory, negotiated with suppliers, and helped troubleshoot problems that arose with permits or inspections. Their success had not removed them from the practical realities of restaurant ownership, but had given them platforms to advocate for other people facing similar challenges. Their training program graduated its 100th student 5 years after its founding. The celebration filled both restaurant locations and spilled into the street, with former students bringing dishes that represented their own evolving businesses. Carmen surveyed the crowd. Single mothers who now ran successful catering companies, formerly incarcerated individuals who had found stable employment in food service, elderly people who had discovered new sources of income and purpose, and understood that her true legacy lay not in her own success, but in the opportunities she had helped create for others. Gregory, watching Carmen interact with her students and their families, recognized how completely his life had been transformed by their partnership. The man who had once measured worth in stock prices and net assets now found meaning in graduation certificates hanging on restaurant walls, in thank you letters from students who had achieved economic stability, in the knowledge that his work contributed to justice rather than merely accumulating wealth. Michael Wellington, now in his senior year of college studying social work and community development, had become a regular volunteer with the training program. His childhood connection to Carmen had evolved into a deeper understanding of his responsibilities as someone born into privilege. He used his family's connections to arrange internships for program graduates, organized fundraising events among his classmates, and wrote his senior thesis on the role of food entrepreneurship in immigrant economic integration. His presence in the program created some tension with his mother, who remained uncomfortable with his interest in social justice work that implicitly criticized their family's past treatment of Carmen. But Mrs. Wellington's discomfort was less important to Michael than his growing understanding of how systemic inequalities operated and his desire to use his advantages in service of change rather than preservation of status quo. The night of Michael's college graduation, Carmen attended the family celebration, not as hired help this time, but as honored guest whose influence on their son had been transformative. The awkwardness of the evening reflected the complexity of relationships that crossed class lines, the difficulty of acknowledgement without full reckoning, the possibilities and limitations of individual change within systems that remained largely unchanged. But Michael's graduation also represented hope, evidence that privilege could be channeled toward justice, that young people could learn from their elders' blindness rather than repeating it, that education could develop not just professional skills, but moral imagination capable of envisioning more equitable arrangements of power and opportunity. Carmen's program began attracting students from other cities, immigrants and returning citizens who traveled to San Francisco to learn not just cooking techniques, but approaches to building community businesses that served their neighborhoods while providing sustainable livelihoods. Carmen and Gregory developed plans to train instructors who could establish similar programs in their own communities, spreading their model while adapting it to local conditions and needs. The expansion required them to articulate their philosophy more clearly, to identify the essential elements that made their program effective beyond the specific context of San Francisco's Mission District. They recognized that success depended not just on teaching technical skills, but on creating environments where students' existing knowledge was honored, where cultural traditions were celebrated rather than assimilated, where business training included analysis of systemic barriers rather than individual responsibility alone. Carmen's reputation attracted attention from policymakers interested in workforce development and small business creation. She testified before congressional committees about immigration reform, advocating for pathways to legal status that would allow undocumented entrepreneurs to operate openly rather than hiding their talents and contributions. Her testimony combined personal narrative with policy analysis, emotional appeal with practical recommendations for changes that could benefit both immigrants and the communities they served. Gregory's role as advocate surprised former colleagues who remembered him as focused solely on profit maximization. His transformation illustrated possibilities for individual change that extended beyond charity to solidarity, beyond sympathy to structural analysis. He used his business knowledge to expose discriminatory lending practices that prevented immigrant entrepreneurs from accessing capital, testified about regulatory enforcement that disproportionately targeted small ethnic restaurants, and organized other privileged individuals to use their advantages in support of systemic change. Their work attracted criticism from some quarters, business groups that saw their advocacy as anti-capitalist, immigration restrictionists who opposed any policies that might benefit undocumented immigrants, food establishment owners who worried that attention to worker exploitation might increase labor costs or regulatory scrutiny. But Carmen and Gregory had learned to measure success not by universal approval, but by meaningful impact on the lives of people they served. Years of partnership had taught them that sustainable change required balancing idealism with pragmatism, pushing for justice while accepting incremental progress, maintaining hope while acknowledging the entrenched nature of systems they sought to change. Their restaurants continued operating profitably, their training program continued graduating successful students, their advocacy continued highlighting issues that might otherwise remain invisible to people with power to influence policy. Carmen's personal life evolved alongside her professional success. Her grown children, initially skeptical of her partnership with Gregory and worried that business expansion might overwhelm her, came to understand that her work represented fulfillment rather than just income generation. Her eldest son, now a teacher in Oakland, brought his students to visit the restaurants and meet program graduates, using Carmen's story to illustrate possibilities for their own futures. Her middle child, a daughter who had struggled with addiction and periods of incarceration, found stability partly through working in one of Carmen's restaurants. The environment provided structure without judgment, employment that accommodated her recovery process, and connection to customers and co-workers who understood struggles with systemic barriers. Carmen's success had created not just business opportunities, but healing spaces for family members who needed second chances. Her youngest son, inspired by his mother's transformation from invisible worker to respected entrepreneur, enrolled in culinary school while working part-time in the restaurants. His formal training complemented Carmen's traditional knowledge, creating opportunities for menu innovation that honored family recipes while incorporating techniques from other culinary traditions represented among their diverse customer base. Gregory's family relationships remained more complicated. His estranged ex-wife had difficulty understanding his new life, viewing his work in the restaurants as self-imposed punishment rather than chosen purpose. His adult children, successful in their own careers but shaped by values Gregory no longer fully embraced, struggled to connect with his transformed priorities and sense of meaning. But these family tensions were balanced by the kinship he had found in his working relationships with Carmen, her family, their employees, and program graduates. Gregory had learned that family could be chosen as well as inherited, that meaningful connection could develop across differences of culture and background, that love could be expressed through shared labor toward common goals. The 10th anniversary of their partnership was marked not with elaborate celebration, but with quiet reflection on how their individual transformations had intertwined to create something larger than either could have achieved alone. They stood in the original alley where their friendship had begun, looking at the mural that now covered the wall where Carmen's first stand had operated. The artwork, painted by neighborhood youth with guidance from program graduates, depicted hands preparing food, multiple ethnicities and ages working together, and the words, "La comida es amor," food is love. Carmen traced the painted hands with her own finger, remembering the fear and desperation she had felt when she first set up her stand in this space. The scared woman who had measured success by daily survival had evolved into someone who measured impact by community transformation. Her hands, still scarred from decades of kitchen work, now guided other hands in learning skills that could lead to independence and dignity. Gregory looked at the mural's depiction of diverse people gathered around tables laden with food, sharing meals that transcended cultural boundaries while honoring distinct traditions. The image represented everything he had failed to understand during his years of wealth accumulation, that abundance meant sharing rather than hoarding, that success required connection rather than competition, that true security came from community rather than individual achievement. Their story had become part of San Francisco's narrative about itself, frequently cited in discussions about immigration, economic development, and social mobility. Urban planners studied their restaurants' impact on neighborhood revitalization. Business schools invited them to speak about social entrepreneurship. Immigration advocacy organizations highlighted their training program as example of how policy changes could unlock human potential that benefited entire communities. But Carmen and Gregory remained focused on daily work rather than their symbolic significance. Each morning brought practical challenges, managing supply chains affected by global disruptions, adapting to regulatory changes, supporting employees through personal crises, maintaining quality standards while expanding operations. Their success had not eliminated the fundamental difficulties of small business ownership, but had given them resources and experience to navigate challenges while staying true to their values. Their impact was measured not just in economic indicators, jobs created, taxes paid, students graduated, but in qualitative changes that were harder to quantify but equally important. Former students who had developed confidence to advocate for themselves in other contexts. Community members who had learned to see immigrants as contributors rather than competitors. Young people who had discovered that business could serve justice rather than just profit generation. Carmen's influence extended beyond her immediate sphere through students who established their own businesses, employees who carried lessons about dignity and respect to other workplaces, customers who applied principles learned in her restaurants to their own interactions with service workers. Gregory's advocacy work influenced policy discussions. His financial contributions supported other social justice organizations, and his presence in coalition meetings helped bridge divides between immigrant advocacy groups and business communities. The ripple effects of their partnership continued expanding in ways they could not fully track or control. A program graduate who opened a successful catering business hired other immigrants facing employment barriers. A former employee who moved to Seattle established a similar training program in that city. A customer inspired by their model started a cooperative restaurant that shared ownership with workers rather than concentrating profits among investors. Their story offered evidence that individual transformation could contribute to systemic change, that partnership across difference could benefit everyone involved, that business models prioritizing community service could succeed financially while serving broader social goals. But they understood that their success represented possibility rather than solution, inspiration rather than replication of a formula that could be applied universally. Carmen's legacy was already visible in the lives she had touched directly and the changes those individuals had created in their own communities. But its full dimension would only be apparent in future generations, in children of her students who would grow up with different possibilities because their parents had achieved economic stability, in communities that had been strengthened by businesses that treated workers with dignity and served customers with respect, in policy changes that had been influenced by advocacy grounded in personal experience rather than abstract theory. Gregory's transformation illustrated that privilege could be redirected toward justice, that personal failure could become foundation for moral growth, that individual awakening could motivate sustained commitment to serving others. His journey from millionaire to minimum wage worker to successful social entrepreneur demonstrated that wealth was indeed possible to redefine, that meaning could be discovered in unexpected places, that partnership across class lines could enrich everyone involved. As evening fell over the Mission District, Carmen and Gregory walked through streets that had been transformed partly through their efforts, but mostly through the collective work of residents who had invested love, labor, and hope in their neighborhood despite facing discrimination and economic obstacles. The area's gentrification continued threatening longtime residents with displacement, but islands of affordability and cultural preservation had been created through businesses like theirs that prioritized community service over maximum profit extraction. They paused in front of a new mural that had appeared overnight, painted by unknown artists along a wall that had been tagged repeatedly with graffiti. The image showed hands holding bowls of steaming food, surrounding text that read, "Todos somos familia," we are all family. The artwork captured something essential about their neighborhood's character and their own partnership, the understanding that survival and success required mutual aid rather than individual competition, that prosperity meant abundance for many rather than accumulation by few. Carmen smiled, reading the Spanish words, remembering how Gregory's vocabulary had expanded over their years of working together to include not just names of ingredients and cooking techniques, but concepts like dignidad, comunidad, and justicia that had no direct translation but required understanding of cultural values that prioritized collective well-being alongside individual achievement. His journey toward bilingualism paralleled his journey toward understanding how systemic inequalities operated and how they could be challenged through daily choices about how to treat other people. Gregory looked at the mural's depiction of hands offering food, thinking about how his own hands had been transformed by years of prep work, scarred by knives and burns, strengthened by lifting heavy pots, made useful through learning skills that served others rather than manipulating symbols on screens that generated profit for himself. The contrast with his previous life felt less painful now than it once had. He had learned to see his downfall as prelude to discovery, his losses as preparation for gains that mattered more than money. Their conversation that evening, walking slowly through streets that felt like home to both of them despite their different origins, touched on plans for expanding the training program, concerns about neighborhood changes that threatened their students' ability to afford local rent, and hopes that their model might inspire similar efforts in other cities where immigrants and returning citizens faced barriers in establishing legitimate businesses. But they also talked about personal matters. Carmen's excitement about her youngest son's culinary school graduation, Gregory's complicated feelings about his daughter's upcoming wedding to someone who shared his old values about wealth accumulation, their mutual worry about aging and what would happen to their businesses when they could no longer manage daily operations with their current intensity. These conversations reflected the depth of friendship that had developed between them, connection that transcended their business partnership to include mutual care about each other's welfare and families. Carmen worried about Gregory's tendency to work too many hours without rest, his difficulty maintaining relationships with people who had known him before his transformation. Gregory worried about Carmen's reluctance to take time for activities that brought her personal joy rather than serving others, her resistance to acknowledging how much the neighborhood and city owed to her contributions. Their partnership had taught them both that care could be expressed through honest conversation about difficult topics, that friendship required challenging each other toward growth rather than simply providing comfort, that love included holding each other accountable to values they claimed to embrace. Carmen's direct communication style had helped Gregory develop emotional intelligence that his privileged upbringing had discouraged. Gregory's analytical approach had helped Carmen articulate political analysis that gave her intuitive understanding of injustice more precise language for advocacy purposes. The walk home took them past the community center where their training program operated, now dark except for security lighting, but still emanating the energy of transformation that occurred there during daylight hours. They paused to look through windows at the classroom where dozens of students had learned skills that changed their economic prospects and their understanding of their own capabilities. The space held memories of breakthrough moments when someone mastered a difficult technique, tearful conversations about family pressures and financial stress, celebrations of graduations and business launches that had once seemed impossible. Carmen touched the window glass, thinking about the women who had passed through that classroom, carrying knowledge from their grandmothers, trauma from their journeys to reach America, and dreams of stability for their children. Many had arrived believing that their traditional cooking skills were worthless in an American economy that valued credential over competence, formal education over cultural knowledge. The program had helped them reframe their expertise as valuable assets that could generate income while preserving cultural traditions. Gregory stood beside her, remembering his first tentative visits to the classroom when he was still learning to see himself as student rather than teacher, still discovering that his business knowledge needed to be combined with cultural humility if it was going to serve anyone besides himself. The community center had become the site of his continuing education about systemic racism, gender discrimination, and immigration policy, topics that had been abstract to him during his years of concentrated wealth accumulation. Their reflections were interrupted by the approach of Maria, their first program graduate, who was walking home from her catering business's latest event. She carried containers of leftover food that she would distribute to homeless individuals camping in a nearby park, continuing the tradition of generosity that Carmen had modeled for all her students. Her success had not separated her from her community's struggles, but had given her resources to contribute to collective welfare. The three of them stood together outside the community center, sharing updates about Maria's business expansion plans, her children's academic achievements, and her concerns about immigration enforcement that had increased stress levels throughout the undocumented community. The conversation illustrated how personal success remained connected to broader political context, how individual transformation required supportive community, how economic sovereignty remained fragile without policy changes that addressed structural barriers. Maria's presence reminded Carmen and Gregory that their partnership's impact was visible not just in changed policies or media coverage, but in daily choices made by people whose lives had been touched by their work. The young woman's confidence advocating for her business interests, her skill navigating regulatory requirements, her commitment to hiring other women facing employment barriers, all reflected lessons learned through programs that combined technical training with political education about rights and responsibilities. As they prepared to part ways for the evening, Carmen surprised Gregory by asking whether he ever missed his previous life: the luxury travel, expensive restaurants, freedom from worrying about monthly rent payments. Her question was asked without judgment, but with genuine curiosity about how someone processed such dramatic change in circumstances and identity. Gregory considered her question seriously, looking back on years when his calendar had been filled with activities that generated wealth rather than meaning, when his social relationships had been based on mutual advantage rather than authentic connection, when his sense of self-worth had depended on external validation rather than internal consistency with values he could articulate and defend. "I miss the security," he said finally. "Not having to check bank balances before making purchases, not worrying about health insurance or retirement savings. But I don't miss the person I was when I had that security. I don't miss the loneliness of success that required others to fail, the emptiness of achievement that served only myself." Carmen nodded, understanding that his answer reflected ongoing process rather than completed transformation. Her own journey had involved similar questioning, acknowledging losses while embracing gains, mourning easier aspects of previous life while celebrating growth that had been impossible under old constraints. Financial security remained important, but it no longer defined her identity or determined her sense of possibility. They walked the final blocks to their respective homes in comfortable silence, each processing the day's work and preparing mentally for tomorrow's responsibilities. Their partnership had settled into rhythms that felt sustainable rather than frantically driven by crisis or opportunity. Stable rather than constantly threatened by external forces beyond their control. The success of their businesses provided foundation for dreaming about expansion, while the success of their program provided evidence that their model could benefit people in other locations facing similar challenges. Carmen's evening routine included reviewing the next day's menu, checking on supply deliveries, and reading emails from students who had established businesses in other cities and wanted advice about challenges they were facing. Her influence had spread beyond San Francisco through informal networks of women supporting each other's entrepreneurship, sharing strategies for navigating discrimination, and maintaining cultural traditions while adapting to American business practices. Gregory's evening included similar business planning, but also time spent reading about immigration policy, criminal justice reform, and economic inequality, topics that had become personally relevant rather than abstract social issues. His evolved political consciousness reflected understanding that self-interest needed to be redefined to include collective welfare, that his own security remained connected to justice for communities that had been systematically excluded from opportunities he had once taken for granted. Both fell asleep that night with the satisfaction that came from meaningful work, secure in the knowledge that tomorrow would bring opportunities to serve others while supporting themselves, to maintain their friendship while pursuing shared goals, to honor their individual growth while contributing to community transformation. Their partnership had become proof that change was possible for individuals, for businesses, and for the systems that shaped opportunities available to people based on accidents of birth and circumstance. The story of Carmen and Gregory continues each morning when they arrive at work, each time a student graduates from their program, each moment when customers connect with each other over meals prepared with love and skill. Their narrative reminds us that invisible people possess visible talents. The downfall can become upgrade when measured by values more sophisticated than wealth accumulation. That partnership across difference requires humility, but offers rewards more sustaining than individual success. And here's why this story moves us so deeply. It reminds us that behind every great meal is someone, often invisible, who poured heart, sweat, and tears into that dish. It teaches that lost wealth can be found again in human connection, and that dignity outshines dollars. Carmen's hands, scarred by years of unacknowledged service, had always held the power to heal and transform. She just needed someone to recognize that power and help her claim the platform it deserved. This story suggests that redemption is possible for everyone, those who have been overlooked and those who have done the overlooking, those who have lost everything, and those who have never experienced real loss. It offers hope that partnership across difference is not just possible, but necessary, that individual transformation can ripple outward to create community change, that the work of feeding others with love and skill is among the most valuable contributions anyone can make to the world. And have you ever cooked for someone who never said thank you? Have you ever found yourself invisible in spaces you helped create through your labor? Tell me in the comments. If this story touched your heart, leave a like and subscribe so this message reaches another woman who cooks with her soul. For more heartfelt stories like Carmen's, click the podcast link. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey. Your presence here means that stories of transformation and recognition will continue reaching people who need to hear them. We'll see you in the next story.